So, over these last couple of weeks, we've been using little clips from a film, a Christmas film, to help us to think about Christmas and Advent and what it all means. And the first week we saw that Jesus was born at just the right time. He was born at a time in history when there had been various empires had risen and collapsed and were now in the Roman Empire. And the Romans had built a whole system of roads. All roads really did lead to Rome. But they had made travel easy. They had made transport better. They protected people. So when Jesus was born and after he went back into heaven and the church started, it was easy for it to spread across the Mediterranean. So it was just the right moment in time. And then we saw that there was good news about Jesus. The shepherds were told by the angels that Jesus had been born. There was good news about Jesus, but we also saw that Jesus himself was the good news. He broke into human history so that he could show how much he loved us. And today I want to start by thinking about one of the Christmas mysteries that always intrigued me as a child. How on earth can Santa deliver presents to every good boy and girl in one night? How is that? And even if you take the fact that it's night somewhere and it's day somewhere else and it kind of moves, how does it work? Well, hopefully we have a little video clip that will explain it.
Tell me, Santa, how does one guy get to every house around the world in one night?
Ah, yes, well, now that is a vexing question, isn't it? But you see, if you could slow time down so that a second became a year, a minute became a century, and an hour became a millennium, well, you could manage it quite easily, couldn't you? Mind you, I remember before, well, 100 years ago, before the population explosion, I could manage to deliver all my goods and have enough time left over for a late supper, a nap, and a round of golf with the Easter Bunny. He winters in New Zealand, you know.
So there you are, easy, isn't it? You just slow time. I suspect, looking at some of you, you've got a different story about that to tell. You may have heard that, you may have been told it. You might even be wondering what on earth this got to do with Christmas and the Christmas story of Jesus. And I'm glad you're asking that. I sense that you're asking it, at least. The thing is that we really need to understand God's methods are not our methods. Part of the miracle of Christmas is the miracle of the method. God's ways of doing things are beyond ours and our understanding. In Romans chapter 11, verse 33, the Apostle Paul writes this: "Who can measure the wealth and the wisdom and the knowledge of God? Who can understand his decisions or explain what he does?" Paul starts a section that goes into there of praise to God by focusing on the fact that as humans we can't fully understand his thinking or his decisions. His riches, wisdom, and knowledge are far beyond us. His methods are beyond our understanding. And sometimes when you think about the way God has done things in the past, and in particular in the Christmas story, it makes about as much sense as Santa delivering all the gifts that way. I don't know about you. If I were writing the script about how God should save humanity, I would have written it really differently. God chose to reveal himself to us in a way that we could understand, but not in a way that we would have expected. He came into the world as a helpless, defenseless baby. He chose to be born to poor parents. He wasn't born in a palace to rich people, but he was born in a stable. He was born to a young couple whose hearts were pure, but who had no earthly influence whatsoever. They were just ordinary, obscure individuals. But they were the ones that God chose to be Jesus' parents. Hundreds of years before Jesus was born, the prophet Isaiah wrote this in chapter 55. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. You know, we shouldn't really be surprised about God's methods. He chose Abraham to leave his home and to go on a journey. But he wasn't going to tell him where he was going until he got there. That takes faith to start off on that kind of journey. He chose Joseph, the second youngest son of Jacob, to be the one who would save that family. He chose Israel, the least important nation, to be his special people. He chose David, the shepherd boy, and not any of his older brothers, to be the king of Israel. He chose Bethlehem, a small, insignificant blot on the landscape of Israel, to be the place where Jesus would be born. You see the pattern being revealed in all of that. Over and over again, God chose simple, ordinary people and places through which he could do his extraordinary work. Luke records in the story of Jesus' birth that Mary and Joseph traveled to Bethlehem to register for a census. And while they were there, the baby was born, and Mary wrapped her son in cloths and put him to sleep in a trough that was designed for feeding animals. So God's methods are not our methods. But the second thing that we need to remember is that God's methods include us. To celebrate the occasion of Jesus' birth, the heavenly choir was sent to earth with the good news. I think that's an amazing thing. I'd have loved to have been there that night to see the choir of angels filling the sky. They didn't go to kings and queens, though. They didn't go to the religious people or to the military leaders. They went to shepherds watching their sheep on a hillside. God chose those people that everybody else looked down on to be the first people to hear the good news that the baby had been born. Part of the miracle of Christmas is the miracle of the method. God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Following his resurrection from the dead, Jesus appeared first of all to a group of women. And in those days, women were of no value. If I had been writing that story, it would have been different. I would have had him appearing to the Pharisees, to the religious leaders, saying, I told you. See, you should have listened. To prove that what he had said was true. But no, it was to the women that he appeared first. God's plan was different. God planned that Jesus would reveal himself to his followers and give them the responsibility to go and make disciples. They were to teach other people about Jesus and to baptize them in his name. Jesus entrusted the good news to this group of people. These people who had run away, who had abandoned him when things got hard, they had disowned him. The people who, while they were living and working together, had argued and fought about who was the greatest. They were an incredibly mixed bunch. There were some who were illiterate and some who had nothing. There were fishermen who had their own business. There was a tax collector. There were some, and all we know about them is their name because they never seem to have said or done anything worthwhile of being recorded. And yet Jesus chose them. And Jesus chose them to take the good news of what he's done forward. And here we are, 2,000 years later, because they were faithful and obedient. They were ordinary folk like you and me. Paul, who was one of the early church's most amazing people, comments on the surprising methods that God used. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, he says this, "Take a look, friends, at who you were when you were called into this life. I don't see many of the brightest and best among you." not many influential, not many from high society families. Isn't it obvious that God deliberately chose men and women that the culture overlooks and exploits and abuses? Chose nobodies to expose the hollow pretensions of the somebodies. That makes it quite clear that none of you can get by with blowing your own horn before God. Everything that we have, right thinking, right living, a clean slate and a fresh start, it comes from God by way of Jesus Christ. I find that quite challenging because I suspect that for a long time in church, certainly I know it to be true of myself, is that we imagine we're somebody. And actually, we're called to be nobody. Sometimes we look down on other people, thinking that we're better. And yet it was those folk that culture overlooked, exploited, and abused that God chose to take his message forward. And somehow we need to get back to that kind of attitude and behavior, that we're not better than other people. We're called to love and to serve others. God's methods haven't changed. He still uses ordinary people to accomplish his extraordinary purposes. Our abilities are not as important as our attitude and our availability. God still gives us the message of the good news of salvation. And lastly, God's methods sanctify us. Sanctify is a kind of religious-y word. It actually means to make us more like Jesus. We're supposed to do that, when we believe. We're supposed to become nicer, kinder, more loving, more caring, more compassionate people. It takes some of us longer than others. But that's what we're meant to do. We're meant to become more and more like Jesus. That's one of the other miracles of the methods that we need to understand. Even now, God is at work in our lives in ways that we do not and cannot fully understand. Just as I would have written a different script for how God should save humanity, I would write a different script for how God should make me more like Jesus. If I was writing it, my spiritual journey would have been one of constant love and adoration. I would have been a wonderful human being, great to be around, full of humor and love and laughter and light. Everything would have been swimming and rosy and wonderful in the garden, and you would have been just desperate to be around me. God's plan was different. I have thorns, just like everybody else does. I have things that I would rather not have done, not have said, not have thought. See, God's script for us includes the experience of problems, pain, and pressure. We experience struggles and sickness, temptations and failures. We take one step forward in spiritual growth and two back. There are victories and celebrations accompanied by defeat and despair. It's not the way I would have written it, but it's the way God chooses to work in us and through us. I honestly can't tell you why some of the things that have happened to you in your life have happened to you. But I do know that when we go through circumstances we don't understand, we're not on our own, because God promises never to leave his children on their own. We can trust that God is at work in our lives, shaping and molding us to be more like Jesus. And that's why Paul writes in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. In all things. Not just in some things, not just in the things that I would like to write in my script, but in all things, God is working for good for those who love him. Even when the angel appeared to Mary to tell her that she would be the mother of God's Son, there was no way she could have predicted what that would have meant for her. Joseph had no idea what would be involved when he responded in obedience to the angel's message to take Mary as his wife. I suspect they endured shame and accusation, embarrassment and ridicule, but they also experienced the miracle of seeing the Word become flesh right there in that stable. They were with God. They got to be parents to Him. The cost of obedience to God's plan was worth it for the prize of being near to God. You know, it's as if God is at work in our lives to produce a beautiful tapestry. But from our perspective, we only see the back of the embroidery. We're looking at the back or the underneath. And we don't really understand what the picture is. Why sometimes it seems so ugly. Why it's so confusing. It's impossible for us to see and to understand all the different knots and the colours and the seemingly random directions things take at different times in our lives. But the front shows a totally different picture. One day, we'll be able to see the front of the tapestry that God has been weaving from our lives. And then we'll be able to see how seasons of pain brought some rich, vibrant colour to the tapestry. We'll see the fullness and richness of God's design reflected in seasons of joy and celebration. We'll see the depth of character revealed through the times of testing and trusting. We'll see that despite our many failures and failings, despite our perceived inadequacies, despite all those times that we thought we weren't good enough, and those times when we were deliberately disobedient, that God has produced this amazingly beautiful tapestry that is your life. And so we continue to trust that He's at work and that He's working for good in us. So trust Him, even though you might not understand what He's doing in your life. Trust Him also when things are going well. Remember that God uses ordinary people like you and me to accomplish extraordinary things for His kingdom. And one day, we will see that beautiful tapestry that He's woven, which is our lives. Amen.